Order. Welcome to the first hybrid meeting of Westminster Hall. For a start, I would remind members there are changes to some of the rules in these new hybrid arrangements. Members present must stand when they're speaking. Interventions are allowed on people present in the room, but not by or to people who are speaking virtually. The timings of the debates have been amended to allow technical arrangements to be made for the next debate. There will be suspensions between each debate. Members not arriving for the start of the debates in Westminster Hall will not be called. And those people who are here, those members who are here, are expected to remain for the entire debate. If members are attending virtually have technical problems, they should email the Westminster Hall clerk's email address. Members attending physically should clean their spaces before they use them and as they leave the room. Members attending physically who are in the latter stages of the call list should use the seats in the public gallery and move onto the horseshoe when seats become available. Members can only speak from the horseshoe. Move then to Scotland and Martyn Day to move the motion. Martyn Day.
Thank you. I beg to move that this House has considered E-Petition 563473 relating to press freedoms and safety of protesters in India. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, Mr Stringer, and I am grateful to take part in this return to Westminster Hall debates with virtual participation, something I know many members are grateful for, as well as giving e-petitions awaiting a debate the public hearing which the petitioners deserve. Farming protests in India may not seem the most obvious issue for a petitions debate, but the committee has always accepted petitions calling on the UK government to engage with other governments on human rights issues. The petition focuses on the protest scene in Delhi and across India following the agricultural reforms agreed by the Indian Parliament. The petition calls on the UK government to urge the Indian government to ensure the safety of protesters and press freedom. It argues democratic engagement and freedom of the press are fundamental rights and a positive step towards creating an India that works for all, and calls for transparency and accountability from the Indian government. The petition has already been signed by over 115,000 people and has until the 17th of June to run. A fact which highlights the public interest and topicality of this issue. The close ties and many family connections between these islands and India are another factor. The petition was created by Gurt Singh, whose family is from a farming background in the Punjab, after the distress he observed when he found his mother in tears watching the Indian news channels' coverage of the protests. He then spoke with relatives in India about the distress they were in and with members of his local community, and it is testimony to his efforts that his local area is in the top 10 constituencies for signatories. Giles Verniers, a political scientist at Ashoka University, has said every farmer community everywhere is discussing these farm laws. It is not just a local or regional matter. He's right. It's even found its way to be debated in these islands. The farming protests are complex in their nature and origins. Indeed, even as a member who takes a keen interest in India and has family connections there, I must admit that prior to this debate being scheduled, I had little knowledge on the subject, other than having seen some brief news footage of clashes between farmers and police in riot gear, from which I had gleaned that it was something to do with farming laws, and that several high-profile celebrities, such as Rihanna and Greta Thunberg, had spoken out about it. I'm grateful to those who have taken time to speak with me over the last few days and to those who have provided briefings. The Commons Library, the Indian High Commission, the petitioner and several political contacts with first-hand experience have all greatly assisted my understanding of the issue. Today, we are not having a debate about the merits of the agricultural reform bills passed by the Indian Parliament. The UK government has repeatedly acknowledged that it is a sovereign matter for the government and people of India. In its diplomatically worded response to the petition, the UK government stated, "We respect that agricultural reforms are a matter for India." This newfound support for self-determination and sovereignty from the UK government is quite encouraging. Those of us from Scotland are paying close attention. The Indian government's right to enforce law and order is also not in dispute, and again has been repeatedly acknowledged by the UK government in its statements on the protests. In its response to the petition, the UK government stated, "We also recognise that governments have the power to enforce law and order if a protest crosses the line into illegality. We look to the Indian government to uphold all freedoms and rights guaranteed in India's strong constitution." However, this debate is an opportunity to note concerns raised regarding the safety of protesters and press freedoms in reporting on the protests. To help those who may be coming to this from a similar knowledge base to where I was a week ago, I believe the background to be as follows. It can be argued that the farmers have been ripped off for generations, that the sector requires reform, and that they have suffered a huge loss of income due to the COVID lockdowns. Agriculture is controlled by the state in India, and 3 farm laws were passed by India's parliament last September, resulting in opposition from farming groups. There are arguments about the constitutionality of the laws, and that is an issue for India's own legislative and judicial process. The farm laws allow for the first time farm gate sales to corporations, put an end to warehouse capacity limits for processors, and introduce tax-free privately owned corporate yards, or Mondays. We have heard reports of water cannon and tear gas being used against the protesters in the early stages of the protests, repeated clashes between police and protesters, and the suspension of mobile, internet access and social media accounts in late January and early February. There are good links to reputable sources on these events in the House of Commons debate pack. Sadly, several farmers have suicided in protest and others have died from exposure during the winter conditions of the protests. Indian farmers have been occupying roads around Delhi since the 26th of November, and on the 26th of January, Republic Day, they drove over 120,000 tractors to the capital. The vast majority of those taking part, it should be stressed, did so peacefully. This was, I believe, inspired by an American farmer's tractorcade, which brought Washington to a standstill in 1979. It's a small world. Across India, some 750 million people are directly engaged in agriculture. That is around half of India's population. Land has been described as sacred and farming seen as a religious duty or way of life. It is a very significant issue for India. This issue has a resonance with the Indian diaspora around the globe, and also for concerned environmental and political activists. While the protests have been largely peaceful, they have on occasion involved the use of direct action, such as strikes and blockades, which have disrupted road and rail traffic. The most significant clash between police and protesters so far came on the 26th of January, when one protester died and more than 80 police officers were injured after protesters deviated from an agreed protest route, including breaching security to enter the iconic Red Fort in Delhi. The BBC cited local media reports of police using tear gas and batons and of protesters driving tractors targeting police officers. The violence was condemned by farmers' groups and union leaders. In response to the violence, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs put out a statement on the 3rd of February arguing that the violence on the 26th of January had been the result of vested interest groups influencing the protests, and that Indian police forces have handled these protests with utmost restraint, despite hundreds of police officers being attacked. The statement also noted that the government has held multiple rounds of dialogue with protesters' representatives and farming unions, and had offered to suspend the implementation of the laws, an offer rejected by farmers' unions who want to see the laws fully repealed. Following the violence at the end of January, the Indian government also temporarily suspended mobile internet access in 3 areas around Delhi where protesters had gathered. The Indian government claimed the suspension was in order to maintain public safety. The UK government has since acknowledged and welcomed the removal of the restrictions on internet access at protest sites in its answer to House of Lords written question on the 22nd of February. However, Amnesty International on the 9th of February released a statement calling on the Indian government to stop what it referred to as an escalating crackdown on protesters and farming leaders, citing reports of arrests, threats and harassment of peaceful protesters. The International Press Institute has taken the matter up in its communication directly with Prime Minister Modi, in which they urge him to take immediate steps to ensure that journalists can work without any harassment and fear of reprisal from the government, and to direct the state governments to drop all charges against journalists, including those under the draconian sedition laws that have been imposed on them for their work. Press freedom and the right to peaceful protest is central to any democracy. So the images over the past few months emerging from India are deeply worrying. Some 67 journalists were arrested and detained last year alone. The escalation in violence and the press crackdown, including over social media accounts, cannot simply be ignored, especially at a time when the UK government is keen to strengthen ties with the Indian government. As the world's largest democracy and a key regional player, India has a pivotal role to play on the world stage. That is why it is vital that the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary impress upon our Indian partners our joint convictions on free speech and the right to protest. In conclusion, I look forward to hearing the contributions to be made in the debate, and I hope the Minister can advise if these concerns will be raised by the Prime Minister on his trip later this year. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered E-Petition 563473 relating to press freedoms and safety of protesters in India. Before I call backbench speeches, 2 points. I'm going to put a time limit on of 3 minutes. I announced at the beginning that honourable members who weren't present at the beginning wouldn't be allowed to speak. However, this is the first time we've had these arrangements, and I will take the 2 honourable members, one of whom I think went to Westminster Hall as opposed to the Boothroyd Room, which is understandable given the title of the debate. I will call those 2 honourable members at the end. I don't expect after this meeting there will be that flexibility, but it makes sense to do it that way on the first meeting. I will then move to Birmingham to Mr. Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. Thank you for your stewardship of this meeting and the first hybrid meeting in Westminster Hall. I think this is a very important issue and a critical issue that we're addressing. This is the largest trades dispute in the world at the moment. This is not just about people being able to have a deal to be able to survive. This is about their livelihoods. There have been huge numbers of farmers that have committed suicide. There are small shareholdings up to 5 acres who would suffer hugely under this law change. This law change is not about looking after the welfare of the farmers in India. In large, one of the most downtrodden communities across the whole of the Indian culture at the moment, because the work that they do, with the hands, the way the whole of the family has to be involved to raise this. For the Indian government then, when they seek for a peaceful change to the legislation that India has taken and the abuses that they have delivered to these people. Initial lathi charges, which was the charges by the police with batons of wood and hitting elderly people in the process, women in the process, not seeing who was there. By and large, predominantly all of the farmers themselves have been peaceful. There have been other individuals from outside the movement who tried to instigate violence. That has been condemned by the Farmers Union. This is about their livelihood. This is not to be treated in a way that disregards all of their issues that they wish to raise within Parliament. This dispute could have been finished quite easily, not 100 days that it's gone on for now. Government has to listen. The government chose not to listen. The government should be working with these poor farmers. They have chosen not to do so. They have taken a belligerent attitude towards this community, the community that provides the crops for the whole of India, the community that actually puts their livelihood supporting the people that eat across, and some of the people, and most impoverished people in India, can get support through this, but by the agriculture and the work that these people do. So India government hasn't been...
Order. Teresa Villiers.
Anywhere in the world, Mr. Stringer, whatever country, whatever continent, agricultural reform is very, very difficult. It's always accompanied by division and controversy. In some instances, there's protests as well, even law-breaking. For example, our nearest neighbour across the Channel has a farming sector very often prepared to embark on civil disobedience and direct action. Well, many of the laws governing India's system of farm support date back to the 50s and 60s, a time when the country was sometimes on the edge of famine. Thankfully, there's been massive change for the better in the intervening decades. Reform of farm subsidy and support has been under active and intensive discussion in India for 20 years. And international bodies like the IMF have welcomed Prime Minister Modi's attempt to take action on this challenge, which so many of his predecessors have backed away from. Now, of course, I accept and understand that protesting farmers feel insecure about their future. But Prime Minister Modi's government has repeatedly said that a core purpose of the reforms is to make farming more profitable, to raise the incomes of people who work in farming, and to promote investment in agriculture to increase yields. Food security is obviously a priority for each and every government around the world. And while the three items of legislation which have sparked so much controversy do mean change, they also leave many structures, principles and rules intact. And Mr. Modi was emphatic in a speech on the 8th of February that the commitment to a minimum support price has been retained and won't be removed by any of these new laws. Moreover, his government has actually offered to postpone the implementation of these new laws for 18 months to allow for more engagement, consultation and discussion with the farming sector. Now, I hear the concerns expressed about the response to the protests, but when thousands and thousands of people are involved in demonstrations and encampments lasting months and months, no policing response can altogether avoid controversial episodes. After all, complaints about police officers here in the UK are frequently made after mass protests. But that isn't evidence that democratic values are under threat in this country, and nor is it in India. India is a country where respect for the rule of law and human rights is constitutionally protected and embedded in society. The authorities' approach to these protests should not shake our faith in that central truth. So rather than denigrating India with unjustified criticism, we should be celebrating it as the democratic success story that it is. Thank you.
We now move to Islington North and Jeremy Corbyn. We can't hear Mr. Corbyn.
Jeremy, you need to unmute. That's it.
I apologise. I've unmuted. I apologise. Thank you for calling me in this debate, and I congratulate the member for Linlithgow on getting the debate and the very excellent way in which he introduced the subject to us today. The fact that over 100,000 people have signed a petition in support of Indian farmers shows the strength of feeling in the Indian diaspora as well as in the rest of the communities all across this country. From clothing workers in Leicester to shopkeepers in London and elsewhere, many, many people in the diaspora have signed a petition to ensure that this debate takes place. Because of the unprecedented nature of the demonstrations in Delhi, but also the unprecedented nature of the support for those taking part in those demonstrations. For all those hundreds of thousands that have protested in Delhi, there have been many more that have joined in. And when a national call was made for a strike, 250 million people took part in it, the biggest ever industrial dispute in the history of this planet. So we should think about why those people are protesting. They're protesting because they're predominantly small farmers on less than 5 acres, many of them very poor. Over 22,000 have committed suicide in the past few years as a result of the stress that they're under. It is as if globalization is being forced upon them and they don't want it. And so this debate is about the media reporting and is about the views that people take all over the world on this. Because when a protest takes place, as the member for Barnet pointed out, there are often protests and there are often complaints. Yes, there are. But the nature of the way in which the protesters, the strikers have been attacked in Delhi is unprecedented, but also unprecedented has been the reaction of the Indian government towards the way in which the media respond. Internet access has been closed down. Media access has been prevented. Mobile phone access has been limited. They have been prevented from getting their message out to the wider world. And last week, a number of colleagues on this call, including my friend the member for Slough and my friend the member for Hayes and Harlington, had a meeting with the National Union of Journalists. And they told us, on behalf of their colleagues in India, how concerned they were at the way in which Indian journalists have been prevented from reporting on it. And indeed, most of the British media have barely reported on it. So in the few seconds I've got left, I'd just like to quote, if I may, from Sabina Inderjit, the General Secretary of the Indian Journalists Union, concluded, our brief view of the prevailing situation, democracy in India is in danger. Its fourth estate is badly bruised and battered. Over the past 5 years, the country's independent and free press, which has aided India to gloat to being a vibrant democracy, is being systematically and ruthlessly attacked like never before. I think we should listen to Inderjit.
We now move to Peterborough. Paul Bristow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. What happens abroad affects us here. This is evident in a pandemic, but true in many other ways. Peterborough is a diverse, multicultural city. We have a large diaspora from the Kashmiri region and Pakistan. We also have many families of Indian heritage. The events in the subcontinent are of daily personal concern. Quite rightly, my inbox and my postbag fill when we witness the disturbances in New Delhi and elsewhere. We can all have our views on the rights and the wrongs of the changes to the Indian agricultural law. It isn't necessary to rehearse those here today, nor for the UK government to side with one view or another. Diplomatic norms should be observed, but those norms assume others. The actions of the Indian government in response to the farmers' protests break accepted norms. They cross a line. And it's terribly sad that we have reached this point, because India is a great country and a proud democracy. As such, it should conduct itself like a democracy and uphold its own constitution. However challenging the situation becomes, its democratic values should not be suspended, even in the face of provocation. Instead, the Indian government has blocked the use of the internet on mobile phones, arrested journalists, and now we read the reports of new legislation to force social media platforms to censor posts and break into encrypted messages. Mr. Chairman, these are liberal measures. The strength of feeling of protesters does not make them acceptable. The excuse of national security does not make them any less authoritarian. Even supporters of the agricultural reforms must have concerns about freedom of speech. The fears of my constituents are evident. One regards the response as an attack on the minorities of India, and particularly the Sikhs. He worries equally about the safety of the protesters and the censorship. Another says, all we are asking is for our voice to be heard by the constitutional and right means. If you think I'm just in demand as your constituent, then please do something about it. They doubt some of the allegations levelled at the protesters and reiterate the heavy-handedness of the Indian government's response. My constituents with family connections to India are right to be worried. It is right that concern is expressed in this House, and I hope the Minister will convey our government's concern. Upholding the law should never be allowed to slide into authoritarian oppression.
Thank you. We now move back to Birmingham with Tahir Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to offer my absolute support and solidarity with the farmers protesting in India. Their protests have brought the world's attention upon India, and in particular on the abuses of the extreme far-right BJP government led by Prime Minister Modi. These protests are for a just cause, as the farmers are fighting against significant privatisation of agriculture, which would negatively impact on their livelihoods. However, as we all know, the BJP and Modi have responded to the protests with repression. Political opponents of Modi in India are at risk of arbitrary arrest, and the civil liberties of all Indians are being eroded by this extremist right-wing government. Therefore, I demand that the UK government condemn Prime Minister Modi and the actions of its BJP government. Its history of abuses and criminality are well documented. Not only do they continue to abuse the human and civil rights of farmers, but also of Kashmiri people through the military occupation of the region. They are cracking down on press freedom and political dissent, censoring critics and blocking access to the internet. A British man, Jagtar Singh Johal, remains imprisoned in India on spurious charges. Furthermore, both Modi and the BJP government are linked with the rise in violent religious persecution within India itself, including attacks on Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians. Therefore, I am calling on the UK government to consider the imposition of sanctions, diplomatic and otherwise, upon Prime Minister Modi and its government. These sanctions should include banning Modi and other representatives of BJP government from entering the UK, and they should extend to the seizure of any UK-based assets belonging to Modi or the BJP government figures until these abuses stop. The UK should further work alongside international organisations to protect human and civil rights in India and Kashmir, including the release of all political prisoners and an end to crackdown on freedoms of press and speech. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you. We now move to Virendra Sharma in Ealing Southall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. I know numerous colleagues are keen to speak and that we have not many minutes, Mr. Chairman, so I will endeavour to be brief. My colleague, the Honourable Member of Ealing North, is unable to be here today, but he asked me to make the Minister aware of his concerns too, and the strength of feeling amongst his constituents who have been in touch with him. They are deeply concerned about the Indian authority use of force and are adamant the farmers must be able to exercise their right to peacefully protest. I'm pleased today, Mr. Chairman, that this debate has been called on the issue of safety of protesters and the continuance of press freedoms. It can never be wrong to stand up for human rights, for the right to peaceful protest safely. The right to peaceful protest is a cornerstone of democracy and a right thousands of Indian farmers are using today and have used for months now. Both sides need to step back, Mr. Chairman. Both sides need to recognize the need to come to an agreement. So I hope, Mr. Chairman, that the minister here today will commit to helping that cause, to offer British skills in the negotiation and compromise to help both sides bring this issue to a close. I know the farmers of India, Mr. Chairman. I grew up in that same community. They worked hard to feed their families and the nation. I know they would not be out there protesting if they could avoid it. So a solution must be within reach. And until that is possible, I thank every constituent who signed this important petition we debate today. The continuation of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly is important to everybody, with the commitment to a democracy, and all those speaking today, all those who signed the petition, and everybody who has written to me is part of that call. We are speaking today to represent more than 100,000 people who have signed the petition. They are British citizens, British Indians, the Indian diaspora, but all care so very deeply about an equitable solution. So I implore the minister to use our skills in compromise to help find a solution that works for both sides. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. And I represent thousands of constituents with family roots in India. Many are Sikhs with family roots in Punjab. I've received a great deal of correspondence on this issue in recent months, and many of my constituents in Wolverhampton South East have signed this petition on press freedom and the defence of the right to public protest. There is a great sense of solidarity with those protesting, a sense that they are fighting for their livelihoods and the right to earn a living. Punjab has long been known as the breadbasket of India, and the Punjabi community here in the UK have very deep family ties with many of the people protesting. Now, the roots of this are the 3 farm laws that were passed last year, which those protesting fear will expose them to huge multinational forces and remove the minimum price guarantees that they currently enjoy. And of course, India as a sovereign nation has a right to debate and legislate for its own laws in this area. But it's also the case, if we look at ourselves, how many countries operate a fully free market system when it comes to agriculture? Systems of subsidy are very common. And there's a great deal of anguish at the sight of protesters being ill-treated, at the internet being cut off, at social media accounts being cut off, and at the arrest of activists. And I would always say that protest must be peaceful. But I note the dignity of these protesters, the provision of langar, free food, Mr. Stringer, not only for one another on the protest, but often for those policing them too. So there is concern about that, and there is also a rejection of the idea that those engaged in these protests are somehow not loyal to India, that the response to people fighting for their livelihoods should be to suggest that they are somehow externally controlled, or to place a question mark around their motivations, saying that they're against the state in a broader sense. What unites those signing the petition and the honourable members here today is a defence of the right of peaceful protest and a desire to see a peaceful resolution of this conflict. So I ask the Minister to convey the concerns of the UK Parliament, to stand up for the right of peaceful protest, to defend press freedom, to explain why there are such concerns here in the UK and to urge a peaceful resolution of this long-running and very serious dispute.
Mr Tamanjeet Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. Some supporters of the governing party in India have said that this is an internal matter. Foreigners, keep your nose out of it. Well, I can tell them why everyone's so concerned. It's because human rights are universal, and a world in which they are upheld is in all of our interests. Hundreds of farmers have died already because of the freezing cold and because of ill health while protesting. For those of us whose parents and grandparents have been tilling the land in the Punjab, have a strong connection with the land, and whose family and friends are involved in the protests, imagine our collective pain when we see scenes of tear gas, water cannon and brute force being used against them. When we see them herded into the protest sites like animals with metal barricades, barbed wire and deadly steel spikes installed in the road, as if it was some sort of international border and not the outskirts of the capital city. The irony of it, Mr Chairman, is that many of them have actually served on the border, or their children or grandchildren are currently serving in the army. Mercilessly, their water supply, sanitation, electricity and internet have been intermittently cut. Trade unionists, human rights activists and journalists, including young women, have been arrested with reports of sexual assault and torture while in custody. The millions of protesters are from across India and different faiths, and yet because a significant number of them are Sikhs, they have been singled out and branded as separatists and terrorists by unscrupulous elements of the mainstream Indian media. This is part of a pattern wherein Muslim Indians are labelled as Pakistanis, Christians as being under foreign influence, and Sikhs as Khalistani separatists. But we see you, and so does the world. Let me let you into a little secret, Mr Chairman, about the Sikhs. They are taught to feed millions of those in need for free, year in, year out, regardless of background or colour or creed. They are brought up to stand up for the rights of others, so you can bet your bottom dollar that they will go to the nth degree to stand up for their own rights. Those of us, like me, who dare to speak up for the farmers, are faced with a deluge of hundreds of fake profiles or the two-rupee Twitter troll factory, and accused by some disingenuous elements of being, amongst other things, a racist. I don't need lectures from them about the wonders of India. I've been fortunate enough to have lived and studied in India for over 4 years, learned to converse in Punjabi, Hindi and Urdu, travelled the length and breadth of this beautiful country and experienced firsthand the warmth and welcome of its lovely people. And while I'm at it, let me also debunk another myth used to silence anyone in Britain, because if they offer anything but praise, they must apparently have a colonial hanger. To those people, I would say, while we spend most of our time discussing national issues, the beauty of being a British parliamentarian is, in the mother of all parliaments, is that almost every day we conduct debates about what is happening around the world. Now, it won't be lost on anybody that the UK Tory government, in its desperation to get a trade deal, is failing spectacularly to stand up for the human rights of those protesters. So I'll call upon the government to request the Indian government to speedily resolve this deadlock and ensure peace and justice for those farmers.
Order. We move to Bradford West now. Naz.
Thank you, Chair. And can I congratulate the member for Lithgow and East Falkirk for securing this debate, and say what an honour it is to follow my honourable friend from Slough, who speaks very passionately about the subject. The truth is, Mr Chair, we shouldn't need someone like Rihanna to speak up on issues like the farmers' protests in India for the world to take notice. But this in itself, in some ways, explains how the world now works. The powerful are heard with a single tweet, whilst the average person's voices are often ignored. This is also one of the central arguments that the Indian farmers are making themselves. The very argument made by these innocent farmers is that when these new laws take place, taking away regulated markets that allow for minimum prices for their crops and are instead replaced by deregulated markets that work in favour of the big, powerful corporations, who then will listen to the average farmer? The Indian government talks about how prices will be able to be negotiated, but as we all know, without the safety net of minimum prices, when the big powerful corporations do the negotiating, it's the average farmer that is left worse off. That is what this debate is really about, ensuring that those voices of ordinary farmers can be heard. And let me be clear, when we raise such issues, because they are very serious concerns from our constituents, who often may have families in India struggling in such circumstances, it is not about being anti-Indian. India is the 5th largest economy in the world. ranked second in the world in agriculture production and ninth in the world for agricultural exports. India has a rich history, culture, and is a rising economic power. But with such rises and economic opportunity comes responsibility. It is important that we support the average farmer, especially when they are faced with large, powerful corporations. This is not a debate of two equals. These farmers are already struggling. More than 52% of India's farmers are living in debt, which is causing a shocking increase in the suicide rate. In 2019 alone, nearly 10,300 farmers killed themselves. Such an alarming situation cannot be left ignored. Adding to this, because the protests have been dominated by Sikh protesters from Punjab, the government has tried to silence their voices by marginalising the issue to a single community. The current Indian government's record on minority rights is not one to be proud of, and I urge them to consider the issues of globalisation and capitalism and in a serious way and avoid making this another case of nationalism and marginalising yet another minority community in India. Thank you.
Thank you. We now go to Oxford Western Abingdon. Layla Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I speak today as the Liberal Democrat Foreign Affairs spokesperson to proudly support Councillor Gurch Singh, who is a Liberal Democrat councillor and who organised this important petition, amassing more than 115,000 signatures. And I hope all honourable members and the Minister will join me in applauding him for his hard work, galvanising greater action on this issue. It is right, I think, for British MPs to speak about this, not just because of our constituents who may have family ties, but because wherever democracy and human rights are under threat, we cannot look the other way. We all know in this virtual Zoom room or elsewhere that democracy doesn't just happen at the ballot box. You must have freedom to protest, freedom of the press, freedom to debate, all cornerstones of a thriving democracy. And this is no small matter. More than 250 million farmers have been protesting since August last year. We are witnessing what could be the largest organised protest in human history. Yet the police brutality and arrests that we have witnessed against peaceful protesters and journalists covering the protests are of deep concern. Tens of thousands of police have been mobilised across India to quash the protests. Barricades and roadblocks have been set up to block protesters, and more than 248 farmers have died just outside New Delhi at camps. Some have died of health issues and others from suicide. And these farmers are sacrificing so much, and all they want is to be listened to. My Liberal Democrat colleagues and I have written to the Foreign Secretary, calling on him to work together with India to ensure that democratic values are upheld and fundamental freedoms, such as the freedom of expression and freedom of assembly and association, are respected. And I'm afraid to say, so far, his response has been woeful. Of course, we welcome close relations between the UK and India, but this must be based on a mutual commitment to human rights, freedom of religious belief, the rule of law, and democracy. The UK must work to ensure these principles are consistently upheld. So can the Minister please update us on what steps the department has taken since the Foreign Secretary met his counterpart in India 12 weeks ago, including at the Human Rights Council? And can they tell us what assessment has been made of whether the new farmers' laws in India are in breach of Article 9 of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources on Food and Agriculture? And will he speak to the FAO about this? The UK has a prominent position on the world stage and in UN institutions. We need to take this responsibility seriously, and I urge this government to act without delay. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move to Nottingham East. Nadia Whittam.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. As a granddaughter of Punjabi farmers, I'm proud to speak today in solidarity with the millions resisting Modi's regime. Farmers across India of all faiths and none, all genders and all castes are protesting laws which threaten livelihoods. 250 million workers went on strike in solidarity. That's the largest in world history. In response, in order to stoke communal violence, Indian government-controlled media has demonised protesters as Sikh separatists and protesters have been met with state repression and brutality. It's timely that this debate is being held on International Women's Day because women are leading this historic revolt. In January, the courts told women protesters to go home. They suggested that women farmers weren't real farmers, but the women workers of India are refusing to be silenced. From farmers' leaders like Jasbir Kaur Nath to jailed climate activist Disha Ravi to Dalit trade unionist Nadeep Kaur, who was wrongfully imprisoned and reportedly sexually assaulted and tortured by police. These women could not contrast more sharply to their sexist government and the misogynistic movement that supports it. When Modi was Chief Minister of Gujarat, he was banned from entering the EU, Britain, and the US for his part in instigating the 2012 riots that saw more than 1,000 Muslims killed. So it should concern everyone that this Conservative government is a close ally of the far-right Hindutva regime in India. Modi spoke alongside David Cameron when he visited the UK. Our Home Secretary is an active supporter of the BJP. And there are billionaire donors who bankroll both parties. In the 2019 election, Hindu nationalists mobilised for the Tories, and the Tories are responsive to their bigoted agenda, like their opposition to banning caste discrimination. Modi and Amit Shah decry the truth as propaganda and divisive, but it's not protesting farmers or Rihanna or Greta Thunberg who are dividing India, it's the BJP. And this Conservative government needs to decide which side it's on, the side of farmers or the side of fascists.
We now move to Hayes and Harlington. John MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. And can I apologise to you and also the Minister? I'm also listed in the budget debate. I might have to leave before the Minister responds. It's beyond my control, I'm sorry. I speak as the Secretary of the National Union of Journalists Parliamentary Group, but of course I also speak as others, as a friend of India, not just because of my constituents who originate from India, but also because of my own family ties. And as a firm and true friend, we have to be honest with our friends in India as well. It's been said here today that India is the largest democracy on the planet, and for a democracy you need a firm foundation of a free press and media. Tragically, at the moment, democracy is being undermined because there are those that are seeking to prevent the operation of a free press and a free media. And it is unfortunate that it is those in government that are part of that process of undermining that free press. And it does so by, regrettably, I just report from the International Union of Journalists and others, we've had 8 journalists killed over the last 12 months. It does so by false arrest and legal actions to deter and intimidate. Journalists arrested on trumped-up charges of sedition, incitement, illegal demonstrations. We've even seen the tax authorities in India used against media operations as well. And of course, as has been mentioned, the suppression of the internet and access to social media. The farmers' protests have excited the latest round of harassment of journalists. And now it seems that simply reporting the actions of the state and the police in violently attacking protesters is somehow an illegal act. Journalists are continuously now being targeted by arrests, intimidation, and falsely accused of criminal charges. And tragically, I think it is a political leadership that feels it can act with impunity. Therefore, we understand that the Prime Minister is seeking a visit to India in due course. Can I suggest that before that, the government calls out the actions of the Modi administration for what it is doing to undermine press freedom, that when the Prime Minister visits India, that he actually meets with the Indian Union of Journalists to find out the exact truth of what's happening there, and also the International Federation of Journalists. but also that actually this government now, through the Prime Minister, demands that the intimidation ends and that the freedom of press and media is firmly guaranteed for the future. That's what a true friend advises.
Thank you. Sam Terry.
I wanted to serve under your chairmanship, Mr. Stringer. Mr. Chair, as my honourable friend, the member for Slough, has pointed out on many occasions, it is not anti-Indian to be voicing concerns about the policies of the government of the day, whoever that may be in India. I want to be clear, I stand in complete solidarity with the hundreds of thousands of Indian farmers, as do tens of thousands of my constituents in Ilford South, who understand that the freedom to protest wherever you are and the ability to provide food and welfare for your family is clearly an international human right. This issue has so galvanised the Indian diaspora community, especially those of Punjabi or Sikh background and others who have land links or familial links to farming in India, that tens of thousands have engaged in global protests, including hundreds and hundreds in streets and towns and cities across the UK. Many of my constituents in Ilford South have been horrified to see the way that Sikh farmers, many of which are their family members, have been treated by the Indian government, having water cannons hitting them, tear gas, brute force used against them repeatedly, while peacefully protesting against this so-called Farmers' Bill. Everyone has a fundamental human right to protest peacefully, and the actions of the Indian government cannot go unchecked. In Ilford, we have a hugely diverse community, and they are fully in support of the Indian farmers, with support extending way beyond our large and vocal Sikh community, with posters up in mosques and churches across Ilford at how outraged people are for what's going on in India. I speak regularly to the members of Singh Sabha London East Gurdwara, my constituency, and they've been thankfully leading this campaign, not just here but globally coordinating the effort to shine a light onto what is going on. Like many members here, I signed a letter led by the Honourable Member for Slough to the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, urging them to engage properly over this issue. And it's important that the torch of truth is shone onto what is happening. India is one of the greatest democracies in the world, but these actions to use water cannons and police to crush dissent strike me as highly undemocratic. Reports of elderly protesters being beaten and police even vandalising tractors owned by pretty poor farmers who are protesting. India's leaders are not behaving, in my view, in the traditions that have made India such a great democracy. And this is of great concern to thousands of my community in Ilford and millions globally. And given the urgency of this matter, I would call on the Minister to urgently speak to our Prime Minister, that he will speak to Mr Modi and seek assurances that there can be a better way forward, that this is something which is bringing such damage to the reputation of India globally. It's simply not acceptable that our Prime Minister is not prepared, again, to raise this with Prime Minister Modi. Now is not the time for the British government to look the other way. Trade deals and crucial business with India or any other nation should not come before standing up for human rights globally. The world is watching. Bole Sunihal Sat Shri Akal, as my constituents say, our local kabaddi club.
Adam Holloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Stringer, and it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. A large number of my constituents have parents and grandparents from India. Indeed, the Honourable Gentleman for Slough was one of them, and he will confirm, as indeed he did in his speech, that very large numbers of them, and virtually every family in my constituency, have got either relatives working on farms or they own land. So this is really a huge concern and worry to many of these families. And it's not just Sikhs. This affects every geography and every creed in India. And I say to the Minister, I fully appreciate that we have limited leverage. This idea that the Prime Minister could tell the President of India what to do is clearly preposterous. However, I do plead with the Minister and the Prime Minister to express it in the most powerful way possible. I mean, looking at the TV images of some of the brutality, I mean, it really is quite extraordinary, and I would judge utterly disproportionate. And the other point I'd urge the Minister to make is, India is a great democracy, and it should have the self-confidence to treat a free press properly. Thank you.
Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. It is indeed a pleasure to serve under your chairship and speak in this debate today. I also want to thank the Petitions Committee and Gurcharan Singh, who organised this petition, which was signed by over 3,400 people in Feltham and Heston. Indeed, it is a great concern to many of my constituents and even to those of other members, including the Honourable Member for Brentford Kniserworth, who was unable to join today. We have friends and family deeply affected by the situation who understandably feel anxious that things could escalate further. And indeed, our local Gurdwara in Hounslow has raised this issue with us. My own family 2 generations ago worked in the agriculture in Punjab. We are all friends of India, and this is another reason why this issue cuts very deep. Men and women have been away from their families on a protest that has now gone on for over 100 days, day after day in incredibly tough conditions. Indeed, you will see on the front of Time magazine this week, the week of International Women's Day, 3 generations of women forming part of the protest. According to Oxfam India, 85% of rural women work in agriculture. Now, Mr Stringer, we know this is an issue that must be resolved through discussions and democratic means in India alone. But in doing that, along with democracy, is a right to press freedoms and safety of protesters. No one supports violence, and that has been rightly condemned. The laws have been suspended for 18 months by the Supreme Court, and a solution must be found. Whilst protests have been largest in Punjab, Haryana and Western UP, there have been smaller protests across the country, with people of different faiths. This is not a religious dispute. The Indian government have said they will preserve the MSP, but this doesn't yet have a legislative base. The laws have led to a fear over income and livelihoods. Experience in other countries has suggested that contrary to improving farmers' incomes, corporatisation has depressed them, and it needs to be debated. But whatever your assessment of the laws, the concerns about press freedom and the safety of protesters are what we discuss today. Issues that led to the Leader of the House here saying that as India is our friend, it is only right we make representations when we think things are happening that are not in the interests of a country that is our friend. The world saw the arrest of 25-year-old Nodeep Kaur and then of climate activists Disha Ravi. The Sessions Judge said in granting bail that citizens are conscience keepers of the government. They cannot be jailed simply because they choose to disagree with state policies. Medical support staff have been beaten at rallies. Concerns have been raised about journalists. The Sikh Human Rights Group, an NGO with special consultative status at the UN, has received highly credible evidence in the form of 20-plus first instance report, or FIRs, from the senior advocate overseeing cases of allegations and charges that are unsustainable being made by the police. And indeed, those who have made any comment against the abuses have been subject to a tirade of abuse from far-right forces. Indeed, approach against Gurdwaras in 3 cities a few weeks ago.
Thank you. We now move on to front bench speeches. There's time for no more than 10 minutes from each front bench spokesperson, leaving a couple of minutes at the end for the proposer to wind up. So we go to Scotland, the SNP's spokesperson, Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr Stringer, and it's a pleasure to see you back in your chair for this afternoon's debate, and I'm sure I speak for everyone when we pass on our thanks to the House staff who worked so hard to get Westminster Hall debates back up and running this afternoon. I'd like to thank all colleagues who have contributed to this debate this afternoon and pay tribute to the tens of thousands of people from across the UK who have signed this e-petition, asking that we in this House take the time to consider the plight of the Indian farmer protesters and the very difficult situation that many journalists currently working in India find themselves in. In particular, Mr Stringer, I'd like to acknowledge the contribution made by my friend, the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk, and thank him for the thoughtful way he opened this debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. As he correctly said in his opening remarks, these are complex issues, and I think it's important that we reiterate and make clear that in today's debate in the UK Parliament, we have no locus on the merits or otherwise of the agricultural reform bill passed by the Indian Parliament last year. The future of Indian agriculture is a matter entirely for the people of India and their government. And likewise, it is right that the Indian government appropriately enforce law and order, and should protest cross a line into illegality, it is not our place to say that they cannot police that appropriately. But what is undeniable is that in a democracy, the Indian government has an obligation to uphold and defend the rights and freedoms guaranteed to her citizens by the Indian Constitution. And that includes the right to protest and the right to a free press, one which is not subject to harassment, intimidation, violence, or state censorship. So while the internal political matter of agricultural reform is not a matter for this House to discuss, I do believe that on matters concerning international human rights, people outside of India can and indeed should make their voice heard. As my honourable friend for Linlithgow, East and Falkirk said, since the start of these protests, there have been numerous and widespread reports of violence being meted out against protesters, both from the police and government supporting mobs. We've all read the reports from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and indeed other human rights organisations, about the beatings and the harassment, the intimidation and the unjustified detention of farmer protesters, which have sadly escalated in recent weeks. Since the tractor rally and the violent clashes on January the 26th, protest leaders have claimed that more than 100 people have gone missing as the Indian government resorts to using laws of sedition in order to clamp down on protest, a move that has prompted the UN High Commission for Human Rights to call on the Indian government to stop, in their words, stop threatening, demonising and arresting peaceful protesters and stop treating them as anti-national or terrorists. And while they were doing that, Amnesty International called for the immediate and unconditional release of activists and others who have been arrested for simply exercising their right to peaceful protest, and for the government to stop the harassment and demonisation of protesters. And in many ways, I'm glad that the UK government has called out the Indian government on this and made their position very clear, and they will continue to champion human rights, and they regard the right to peaceful protest, freedom of speech and a free press to be a vital part of any democracy. Of course, Mr. Stringers, we heard from so many honourable members this afternoon, including the Right Honourable Member for Islington North. The crackdown against farmer protesters didn't happen in isolation. It was coupled to a raft of draconian measures around the ability of the press to report freely on what was happening. And the Honourable Member for Peterborough was right when he described those clashes of the January the 26th and how the Indian government ordered mobile internet services to be suspended around the Delhi area where the farmer protest was ongoing, claiming that it was to maintain public safety. The move was quickly condemned by campaigners and trade unions who pointed out that under international human rights law, India officials should not use broad, indiscriminate shutdowns to curtail the free flow of information or to harm people's ability to freely assemble or express their political views. A few days after the suspension of those internet services, the government actually ordered Twitter to suspend the account of hundreds of users claiming that they were inciting violence. And a Guardian report afterwards said that those Twitter accounts actually belonged to news websites, activists and actors. And around the same time, as we've heard, 8 journalists who were covering the protest were arrested on what Human Rights Watch have described as utterly baseless criminal charges. With 8 journalists facing criminal charges, including sedition and promoting communal disharmony and making statements prejudicial to national integration, it's right that we as an international community speak out in condemnation. And as the Honourable Member for Nottingham East pointed out, the arrests of the journalist came just before other detentions, including the 22-year-old climate activist Disha Ravi, who was accused by police of being a key conspirator and a formulator and a disseminator of a protest toolkit for farmers. They also indeed claimed that she shared that knowledge with Greta Thunberg. I was struck by the Right Honourable Member for Chipping Barnet when she suggested that what was happening was nothing unusual. I beg to differ. because these draconian clampdowns on press freedoms and individual freedom of expressions have not just been condemned by international organisations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, but a whole raft of journalist groups within India have been unequivocal in their condemnation. The National Union of Journalists in India, the Editors Guild of India, the Press Club of India, the Indian Women Press Corps, the Kashmiri Journalists Association, the Delhi Union of Journalists, the International Federation of Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, and the Indian Journalists Union have all released statements on the crackdown of press freedoms and in support of the journalists covering it. And as we heard, the International Press Institute have taken the matter up directly with the Prime Minister, asking him to intervene. Mr. Stringer, as it said in the opening minutes of this debate, how India wants to organise its agricultural sector is entirely and exclusively a matter for the Indian government and its people. Human rights abuses and the silencing of the press are a matter for us all. As Razat Khosla, the Senior Director of Research of Advocacy and Policy at Amnesty International, said, "We have seen an alarming escalation in the Indian authorities' targeting of anyone who dares to criticise or protest the government's repressive laws and policies. The crushing of dissent leaves little space for people to peacefully exercise their human rights, including the right to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly in the country." There has been, Mr. Stringer, an alarming escalation in the Indian authorities' targeting of anyone who dares to criticise or protest against them. So we add our voice to those in the international community and in the domestic organisations calling on the Indian government to immediately stop its crackdown on the protesters, the farmers' leaders and journalists. We want to see the immediate and unconditional release of all of those who have been arrested and detained solely for peacefully exercising their rights to freedom of expression and assembly. The shutting down of the internet, the censoring of social media and the use of draconian laws against protesters and journalists who have been peacefully voicing opposition to the new laws or have been questioning the government's methods must immediately cease. Mr. Stringer, freedom of speech, the right to protest and a free press are the hallmarks of a democratic society. A democracy cannot function if those fundamentals are under attack, being suppressed, or are being eroded. Right now, it appears that all is not well in what is the world's largest democracy. And it's up to the Indian government to show its own people and the international community that it wants to protect that democracy and create a country that works for all of its citizens. And I would urge the Indian government to take heed of what's been said here this afternoon and indeed across the world and look at its own actions and act in the benefit of all of its citizens.
Thank you. We move to Labour spokesperson Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I'd like to start by thanking the Petitions Committee and the member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for opening this debate. And I'd also like to pay tribute to the many tens of thousands who secured the debate through the petition process. What a great example of democracy in action. We've heard so many memorable and passionate contributions today, and I look forward to the Minister setting out what actions the government will be taking. I'd particularly like to thank other contributions to the debate, not least from my 11 honourable friends who have, on these benches, who have contributed to the debate today and made some truly compelling arguments. The fact that the overwhelming majority of contributions to the debate today have come from the Labour benches shows how hugely important this issue is to our party. The farmers' protests taking place in Delhi, of course, relate to 3 new agricultural laws which affect farmers. Taken together, they loosen the rules around the sale, pricing and storage of farm produce. They allow private buyers to stockpile essential commodities for future sale, and they set out rules for contract farming. The legislation is, of course, deeply controversial, and opposition figures and the protesting farmers have complained that there was insufficient consultation. The ongoing protests on the outskirts of Delhi illustrate the strength of feeling and the level of anger that so many members of the farming community feel. And Prime Minister Modi will by now be acutely aware of the backlash against his policies. But Mr. Stringer, India is a sovereign democratic nation, and its agriculture laws are a domestic matter. In a democracy, there will always be different views on the right course of action to take, and we acknowledge and fully respect that those views are held passionately by many British Indians and those who retain close ties to India. But as this is a domestic issue, it would not be appropriate for the UK Labour Party to comment on the specifics of the legislation itself, and so I will not be doing so today. However, since the first worrying evidence of escalating violence emerged, we on these benches have been urging the Indian authorities to protect and to defend the universal human rights of all those protesting in India. And I can assure honourable members gathered here today that we shall continue to do so without fear or favour. The Labour Party's foreign policy puts the rule of law, democracy and universal human rights and freedoms at the very heart of our global agenda. And we call for these principles to be upheld consistently in every country across the world. So let me stress in absolute terms that the Labour front bench stands firmly behind the rights of Indian farmers to exercise their right to freedom of assembly, freedom of expression and the right to peaceful protest. This is why on the 1st of February I issued a statement in which I drew attention to the escalating violence and the clashes between the farmers and police and the threat to essential democratic rights. I called on both sides to show restraint, but made clear that the onus is on the Indian authorities to protect the farmers' right to peaceful protest, to respect their right to freedom of assembly and expression, and to respond to any incidents of civil disobedience in a proportionate and appropriate manner. For instance, we are deeply concerned about reports of live ammunition being used by the police. And we, of course, call on demonstrators to keep their protests peaceful and within the constraints of the law. The Red Fort incident on the 26th of January is an example of where both sides must understand the limits of what is acceptable and that certain actions are likely to provoke outrage and escalation. In recent weeks, campaigners have been particularly concerned about the Indian authorities' disregard for freedom of expression and specifically for media freedoms. Human Rights Watch have stated that during these protests, the authorities have introduced politically motivated charges against activists and charged journalists and opposition politicians with sedition simply for reporting on claims made by the family of a dead protester. And following the Red Fort clashes between protesters and police, the Indian government shut off the internet as a way of curbing the protest, suspending 4G mobile internet services in 3 areas around Delhi, where tens of thousands of protesting farmers are camping. Services were restored, but it is clear that bans of this sort violate basic freedoms. The Labour Party therefore calls on the Indian authorities to recognise the vitally important role that independent journalism plays within a democracy and to protect its journalists from reprisals. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend. In terms of independence and the link between the government and certain celebrities, the farcical manner in which some Indian actors and cricketers copy-pasted the official government line simultaneously onto their social media accounts not only exposed to a global audience the 2019 Cobra Post Cash for Tweet string operation, but severely dented their credibility and conscience. Does my honourable friend agree that if our government had issued such an edict within our country, they would have been laughed out of the country, and subsequently celebrities with a conscience would have tweeted out the exact opposite in defiance?
Stephen Kennedy? I agree with my honourable friend that the media and social media should never be manipulated for such political purposes in terms of speaking through others in a way that is not clear in terms of where the originator of the message is coming from. And it's very important that the media is used as a neutral source of information rather than one that is loaded with a particular agenda. Another universal human right is that of religious freedom. Prime Minister Modi will be aware of the deep concern that protests by farmers about economic issues, which is what this is about, have resulted in a significant backlash against Sikhs. He will have seen the instances of government supporters holding rallies outside Sikh places of worship and the fear that this will have engendered. Mr. Modi must recognise his responsibility in line with international law to keep... I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and indeed he'll be aware of the car rallies that were targeting Southall, Leicester and Birmingham just 2 weeks ago that caused great concern, and I do pay tribute to the Home Office and the police at that time. But does he agree with me that this is why it's so important that interfaith communities like Southall Interfaith Forum and Hounslow Interfaith Forum that came together at that time and had said that they stand firm against right-wing groups who want to harm our community? It's vital that we across the world defend our democracies and freedoms and protect our communities from attempts at this division.
Stephen Kinnock. I agree absolutely with my honourable friend, and let's be clear that this must be seen as an economic and a political issue and debate, and that must never be allowed to tip into prejudice around people's faith or their ethnicity. It's vital that we keep this focused on the issue that the protesters are in fact protesting about, and Mr. Modi does need to recognise that the world is watching, and what happens in India, of course, resonates here in our country. He must recognise his responsibility in line with international law to keep the Sikh community safe and confident in India's law enforcement. This recognition is important for the individuals and families affected, but also for those of us who are so keen to see India flourish as the great, successful, multicultural nation that we know it to be. The UK government naturally and rightly values its trade relationship with India, which stands at more than £18 billion annually. But the UK-India relationship must be broader and deeper than just trade. It should be based on working in partnership on issues of security and climate change, but it critically must be about the joint promotion of democracy, human rights and upholding international law. On the 1st of February, I asked the Foreign Secretary to raise the issue of human rights with the Indian government. And today I urge the UK government to engage more actively and more urgently with New Delhi. With this, I ask the Minister, what steps has he taken to engage proactively with his counterparts in New Delhi to ensure the right to peaceful protest is being upheld? Second, what representations has he made to his Indian counterpart about the need to resolve this situation peacefully by working with all parts of Indian society, including trade unions, and the need to advance the negotiations that have stalled? Thirdly, will he publish a broader strategy to defend internet and media freedom, not just in India, but also in other places such as Belarus, Hong Kong and Uganda? Fourthly, what steps has the UK government taken to support the right of Amnesty International, which was recently forced to discontinue its operations in India? And finally, the invitation to join the G7 in Cornwall represents a significant development in India's role as a leading nation in global politics. Can the Minister confirm that the Prime Minister will be taking this opportunity to stress to Mr. Modi the need for India to adhere to the high standards that are expected within the international community, in particular with regard to universal human rights and the rule of law? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Adams.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stringer, and a pleasure to serve in your chairmanship under these new arrangements. And so far, so good. The technology appears to have worked very well. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for introducing this debate here today in an excellent way. I pay tribute to the work the Honourable Member has done on the Petitions Committee. And I'm also very grateful to the contributions from all Honourable and Right Honourable members, many of whom have given very passionate speeches this afternoon, understandably so given the interest within Honourable and Right Honourable members' constituencies and their own personal connections with this part of India. And I'd also like to thank Councillor Gurchan Singh, who the Honourable Member for Oxford West and Abingdon rightly commended for initiating the petition and ultimately this debate. Now, there are clearly very strong feelings about the farmers' protests and press freedoms in India, both inside and outside of the House, as indicated by the fact that over 100,000 people have signed this petition. And can I thank every single one of them as well for taking such a keen interest and bringing this subject to the House. I'll try and respond to as many of the points raised by honourable members as part of my remarks, but I am conscious I need to give the honourable member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk a few minutes before the end of this debate. He says, hurriedly looking at a clock to see how long we've got. Mr. Stringer might give me a pointer at some point. So I can start by saying our officials from our network of high commissions in India have monitored and reported back on the protest in response to the agricultural reform laws ever since they first flared up in September. In January, the Indian Supreme Court suspended the reforms and established an expert committee to scrutinise the laws. We understand the committee has completed its consultations with concerned parties and will give a final report to the Supreme Court at the end of the month. We're also aware that the Indian government has met with farmers' unions on several occasions and that those talks remain inconclusive but are ongoing. Understandably, these events have caused alarm and uncertainty for many British people who have family ties to farming communities in India. The government's written response to this petition aimed to address those concerns while also making clear that agricultural policy is a domestic matter for the Indian government, as the Honourable Member for Aberafon, the official opposition spokesman, has also confirmed. However, the UK government believes firmly that freedom of speech, internet freedom, which has been raised by Wolverhampton, the Honourable Member for Wolverhampton South East and many others, alongside the right to peaceful protest, are vital to any democracy. And we also accept that if a protest crosses the line into illegality, security forces in a democracy have the right to enforce law and order in a proportionate way. We encourage all states to ensure that domestic laws and the way in which they are enforced must comply with international human rights standards. And in that spirit, we look to the Government of India to uphold the freedoms and rights guaranteed to its people by its constitution and by the international instruments to which India is party. Now, during the debate, concerns have also been raised by Right Honourable and Honourable members, including the members for Islington North, Peterborough, Ealing Southall, and the SNP spokesman for the Honourable Member for Argyll and Bute, about press freedom in India. And again, let me be clear that this government believes that an independent media is essential to any robust democracy. That's why we are committed to championing media freedom around the world, as is evident from our ambitious media freedom campaign that we launched in November 2018. India has a vibrant media scene which promotes lively debate across the political spectrum, and the UK government has worked to support this democratic tradition. For example, in 2019 we awarded scholarships on our flagship Chevening programme to 7 talented and aspiring young Indian journalists. And last year we supported the Thomson Reuters Foundation to run workshops for Indian journalists to help them report on human rights issues. Now, my colleague, Lord Ahmed of Wimbledon, is the Minister responsible for both human rights and for our relations with India. He regularly discusses media freedom, including the Media Freedom Coalition, of which the UK is a founding member, with India's Minister of State for External Affairs. And members, honourable and right honourable members, will recognise that this is a time of great ambition for the UK's relationship with India. Both governments are working to advance shared priorities across trade and investment, health, sustainability and climate change, and defence and security. We're also working with India as a force for good on the UN Security Council and as one of the Prime Minister's guest countries at the G7 summit later this year in June. This cooperation will help us fix global problems, and it will strengthen prosperity and well-being in India and the UK. However, whilst this is an exciting time for the UK-India partnership, it does not hinder us from raising difficult issues. And a number of right honourable and honourable members, including the members for Ilford, Hayes and Harlington, Birmingham, Perry Barr, raised the upcoming visit of the Prime Minister to India. This will be an opportunity to arrange and discuss a range of bilateral issues with India where we have serious and specific concerns. We will raise them directly with the Indian government, as you'd expect of a friend and neighbour. Candid discussions are an important part of our mature and wide-ranging relationship with the Indian government. Now, I know the Honourable Lady for Oxford West and Abingdon and the Honourable Member for Aberavon wanted to know what further discussions the United Kingdom has had since the Foreign Secretary discussed the farmers' protest with his counterpart during his visit to India in December. Well, this month alone, senior Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office officials have met with the Indian High Commissioner and discussed this very thing, the UK parliamentary interest in the freedom of civil society groups, for example, to operate in India. And Lord Ahmed of Wimbledon speaks regularly to his counterparts in the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, as well as to the High Commissioner here in the UK. Human rights issues are an essential part of these conversations. The Honourable Member for Oxford West raised the issue about Article 9. We've not made an assessment of India's agricultural bills in relation to Article 9. I will certainly consult officials on this, but would stress again that these reforms are a domestic matter for India. The Honourable Member for Birmingham Hall Green raised the issue of sanctions. This sanctions regime, which we launched in July, enables the UK to impose sanctions on those who commit serious human rights violations or abuses. It's not appropriate to speculate on who may be designated under the regime in the future, as to do so could very well reduce the impact. And again, the opposition spokesman raised the issue of Amnesty International in India. We raised this case with the High Commissioner on the 1st of December, and officials via Lord Ahmed and our officials have raised our concerns most recently in November as well as December. So we've requested that Amnesty's accounts be unfrozen while the investigation is ongoing. In our contacts with the Government of India, we've noted the important role of organisations like Amnesty in a democracy.
Can the Minister bring his remarks to a conclusion?
I can.
Very
So
quickly.
thank you, Mr Stringer. Let me end by reassuring colleagues that the UK Government will continue to monitor developments relating to these protests incredibly closely, and where we have concerns, we will continue to raise them with the Indian Government while respecting the fact that these agricultural reforms are an internal matter.
Thank you. Back to Scotland. Martyn Day to wind up.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. May I take this opportunity to thank all who took part. It's fantastic that these debates are taking place, so my thanks to the House authorities for facilitating them. although we could clearly have done with a much longer debate. The spirit of today's contributions was very much one of concern born out of friendship. The images and testimonies that we heard today are thoroughly depressing. We rightly regard India as a valuable friend and ally, which makes it imperative that we do not turn a blind eye to the events taking place. To do so would be a failure of both diplomacy and friendship.
Order. Order. In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am suspending the sitting. Please will members participating physically leave the room promptly by the exit door on the left while observing social distancing. Thank you.